All right, so let's talk about a little bit about being a startup founder. What does that cost for real? Well, for me, the first thing that I am seeing and in my experience that I know about is really different if you are founding a company that involves hardware or something physical versus software or a service or something like that. And already I would say if you're thinking that your service is going to be a startup, that's a red flag for me. Unless it's a software as a service, then it's probably not a startup. Not many service businesses become startups because startups are all about growth. So if you really think about being a startup founder, you're thinking, I'm going to create something that at some point the sales are going to go whoop, like straight up. That's what investors are expecting. That's what you're going to have to deliver in order to really participate fully in this ecosystem. Okay, so now let's go back to the hardware versus software thing. Hardware is a lot more capital intensive. It's a lot harder to bring people around a hardware project. What do I mean by hardware? An invention, something that you would have to fabricate, hire somebody to manufacture for you and to sell. If you're thinking, I want to sell t-shirts, I want to sell a clothing brand, again, I wouldn't consider that a startup. And that's not going to really be a startup in the mind of investors either. So it's going to be hard to take advantage of the whole startup ecosystem in that sense. A hardware startup really usually involves a patent. And a patent is also very hard to obtain. Hardware startups tend to be harder to start, but if you can start one, then they're very defensible, which is great if you can get there. Meaning that, basically if you have a patent for a novel idea or a novel product, then once that patent is granted, nobody can copy you. And so you really have a monopoly on the demand for that product. From there on out, it's a question of manufacturing, distribution, marketing, and stuff like that. Most people who become startup founders, they start software companies. So what are the costs of that? Well, that's tricky. One thing that I've seen is you have this difference between what I would call deep tech versus more traditional software offerings. Okay, so what do I mean by deep tech? So you might have heard of ChatGPT, for example. Well, that is a new form of technology. The fact that an AI neural network can chat with you and generate these really valuable responses is new. That had never existed before ChatGPT. So if you are creating new, novel technology that has never existed in the past, I would consider that deep tech. That's also a harder thing to raise money for. Of course, there are people who really like that stuff and it can be incredibly valuable. But again, it's closer to the hardware type of business where it's going to take you a long time to develop usually. Deep tech takes, maybe even years, 10 years to develop. But of course, once it's developed, you kind of have an edge on the market and it can be extremely valuable. Most people start software companies that are delivering some form of value to some end users, basically solving a problem. And frankly, what it really is some type of automation in most cases. So for example, you could say we make it easier to sign documents online. That's DocuSign. We make it easier to send email messages to lots of people. Well, that's MailChimp. And what that is doing is basically automating parts of the world that used to take more time or more money and making it into software, something that is going to be predictable and repeatable. So what does that look like? Well, what I've identified there is that in those types of startups, which is most startups, there's a technology product involved. Now, this is not deep tech. This is a technology product that usually does involve coding, for example. And I've seen some people that try to say, oh, but I'm going to do no code solution for my app or whatever. Usually I find that those things fall apart. In my experience, any type of drag and drop app or no code solution, it just doesn't work when you actually start getting into the field and start solving the problem. Customers usually won't pay for a no code solution. And in my personal experience, I could be wrong. So basically what I'm saying is that's why coders become startup founders so often. Because what I find is the limiting variable for most startup founders that are in that, they're not in deep tech and they're not in hardware, they're in that traditional kind of software phase, the kind of company that we've created. It's usually run, at least one part of it is a coder, because that is the person who's going to build the product. And if you don't code, coders are going to be expensive, or maybe you can find a coding co-founder, but that's a huge expense to the whole startup game. It's just getting a product up that people will actually pay for. And I found personally, I used to argue against that and say, oh, look, we're going to build this startup thing. You should invest in this idea. Well, in my experience, investing in the idea is pretty weak. What investors do want to invest in usually is a founding team. But what they're going to look for in that founding team, guess what? Usually it's a coder. They're going to say, who's going to develop this technology? Most of the investors that I've met do not want to fund a company to go and hire developers to build their idea. That's just not what investors usually back in my experience. So to kind of sum up, what are the costs of being a startup founder? Well, if it's hardware, it's a lot of capital because you're going to need to do a lot of research, and you especially have like patent attorneys, which can be very expensive. Because basically, if you're creating some type of hardware, you're going to run into some type of patent issue. I mean, you're going to need to make sure that there's not, for example, another patent that you would be infringing on by manufacturing this product. So then deep tech, it's kind of similar. I mean, in this case, though, rather than creating hardware, you're going to create some novel technology that took many PhDs to develop. Like if you look at ChatGPT, I mean, these are all like PhDs in computational science and related fields from, prestigious universities. These people require big salaries. So like it's going to take a lot of money to pay those people a long time to develop this new novel technology. And then in the traditional software space, basically your startup costs are really centered around your time. And usually it's the time of a coder, and the coder getting some product up that you can start marketing, start seeing how customers interact with it. I would say that the main cost of that kind of company, a more traditional startup company, is whatever it costs for you to get the code built for your first iteration of your technology product.